The bitter winter of 1871 had wrapped the small coal mining town of Pennsylvania in an unyielding sheet of ice and snow. The streets were narrow, lined with rows of wooden houses, their rooftops heavy beneath layers of frost and icicles hanging. Like teeth from the eaves, the snow was deep enough to slow even the strongest horses, and the roads were hard and slick. Underfoot, the sounds of the town were muffled by the cold air, the creak of wooden wheels on the frozen ground, the dull thud of coal being unloaded from carts, the hiss of steam escaping from the blacksmith's forge, and far off the long, mournful whistle of a locomotive drifting through the valley. Townsfolk moved quickly through the streets, wrapped in thick wool coats, with scarves wound high over their mouths and noses, their breath rising in white plumes against the pale sky. Boots crunched on the frozen ground, and gloved hands clutched baskets heavy with goods from the market. Children clung to their mothers, skirts eyes lowered against the wind, which sliced through the streets like a living thing away from the main road. The noise and bustle faded into the narrow back lanes, where the air felt even colder here. Behind Baker's general store, the snow told a different story. Small barefoot prints pressed into the soft white trail leading into a dark corner of the alley. The light barely touched this place. The buildings leaned so close together that shadows lay thick and the wind funneled through. In sharp, icy gusts, in the shadow of a wooden crate, huddled a boy no more than 9 years old, his small frame swallowed by tattered rags so thin they could hardly keep the cold at bay. The fabric was torn in places, the edges stiff with frost. His hair was dark and tangled, matted against his head by damp, and his skin was pale, the grayish tone of someone who had been too long in the cold. His hands were raw and cracked, the skin split and bleeding from the icy air, and he held them close to his chest as if trying to keep whatever warmth was left trapped inside. His lips were pale and trembled with every shallow breath. His gray eyes, the strange muted color of smoke from coal fires, stared not at the man approaching him nor at the crate beside him, but at the ground, as though the snow itself had stolen his attention. There was something in those eyes that did not belong to a child, not fear exactly, but a kind of emptiness, a quiet distance, as if whatever life or memory had once been there had been swept away, leaving nothing but him. Baker, the storekeeper, stepped out of the back door, his heavy boots grinding against the snow in slow, deliberate steps. He carried with him the faint scent of yeast and sugar from the loaves cooling inside his shop. The cold bit at his cheeks, turning them red beneath his thick brown beard. His breath poured out in clouds as he moved toward the alley he had come to throw out the scraps from the day's baking, but stopped short when his eyes fell on the boy. For a long moment Baker stood there, his eyes narrowed, studying the figure crouched against the crate. He saw the thin shirt stretched tight across the boy's chest, the trousers frayed and patched in different cloth, the bare feet sunk into the snow, already flush pink with cold, and around the boy's neck hung a thin cord from which dangled a small brass key, tarnished and worn. The storekeeper felt a strange unease settle over him. Boy, what are you doing out here? Baker said, his voice low but carrying in the still air. But the boy did not move. He did not even blink, as though the question had not reached him. The wind curled through the alley, pushing loose flakes of snow into the corners. Baker stepped closer, his shadow falling over the boy, and the sound of his boots crunching in the snow echoing against the walls of the alado. You have a name? Baker asked again, his voice softer this time, as if speaking to someone half asleep. The boy moved, then only slightly, his head lifting in a slow, uncertain motion, as if the effort itself was heavy. His eyes blinked once, twice, then fixed on the man before him. There was no spark of recognition in his gaze, no flicker of fear or gratitude, only that same flat stillness. Storekeeper waited. The silence between them stretched, and the only sound was the whistling wind far above. Finally, the boy opened his mouth, his voice thin and cracked, almost swallowed by the cold air. I don't know, he said, and the words trembled In the space between them, like fragile things that might break if touched, Baker frowned the weight of those words pressing into him more than he had. Expectedus' gaze drifted again to the small brass key on the cord. It was not like the keys used. For houses in the town, its teeth were intricate, finely cut, the kind of key that opened something valuable or secret. The boy seemed unaware of it. His hands never touched it. His eyes never glanced down to see it. Baker crouched so he was level with the boy, his knees creaking in the cold. He looked closely at the boy's face, taking in the lines of dirt on his cheeks, the shadow of hollows under his eyes, the way his breath came in short, uneven pulls, as though each one cost him more strength than the last. Up close, Baker could see the boy was shivering violently, but made no effort to move, as if he had accepted the cold as simply part of his world. Baker thought of calling someone from the street to help, but something about the boy stopped him. Perhaps it was the way he sat so still, so silent, or perhaps it was the sense that he did not belong to the streets of this little town at all, as though he had come from somewhere far away, somewhere where things had gone terribly wrong. Wind rose again, slicing through the narrow space of the alley, bringing with it the distant sound of a carriage on the main road. Baker reached out his gloved hand. "Come on, lad," he said gently, his voice carrying a note of insistence, but the boy did not move. His eyes flickered briefly toward the far end of the alley where the light was weakest, and for a moment Baker wondered if he was looking for someone or if he feared that someone would. A personal swirled around them in fine powder catching in the folds of Baker's coat and in the boy's dark hair. Baker took a slow breath, his fingers tightening inside his gloves. He had seen stray dogs in the snow, he had seen beggars at the edge of town, but there was something about this boy that was different, something that told him this was not a simple case of a lost child. Without another word, Baker stepped forward, closing the distance, and laid a heavy hand on the boy's thin shoulder. The fabric beneath was stiff with cold, and the boy flinched, almost imperceptibly, as though the touch startled him, but still he did not pull away. The cold tagged along with him into St. Brigid's orphanage, the big old wooden doors complaining as they swung open so Baker could carry the kid inside. It was cozier in there, with the scent of wood burning in the fireplace and bread baking somewhere, giving off a faint sugary smell. But the little guy was still shaking, his tiny body all shook up from going from that nasty wind to the toasty hall. Inside, the light from the fire danced on the stone walls, making the place feel a bit homier. And there were these gold-tinted shadows playing across the benches where kids were slurping down hot soup. They all looked up as Baker went by, probably wondering who the new face was. Sister Agnes walked into the main area, looking all proper in her black outfit with her eyes that could see right through you, but in a nice way. She checked out Baker first, then looked at the little kid he was carrying like a football. The kid was all bundled up and she looked kind of worried. Baker started whispering a story about finding this boy outside, in an alley, with no shoes or jacket, just sitting there, not saying much except that he couldn't remember his own name. Sister Agnes showed them to a little room at the back, and boy, was it quieter in there. The noise from the other kids playing didn't bother them anymore. She had Baker put the kid on a chair made of wood, and he just sat there without complaining, not even looking up. His hands were in his lap, and his stare was glued to the floor. Like the patterns in the flagstones were more interesting than all of us. Sister Agnes got down to his height and checked him out real close. She was looking at his tiny, pale face and those old soul eyes of his that were grayer than anyone else's at his age. It was like he was seeing something else, not really with us in the room. "Can you tell me your name, little one?" she said in a soft tone. The boy barely lifted his head, looking at her with those sad gray eyes of his for just a quick second before they floated away again. He seemed like he was gonna speak, but then nothing came out. So she waited a bit and tried asking something else. "Hey, where do you live?" Who are your mommy and daddy? But the kid just shook his head real slow. Like he didn't get it, or maybe the answers were just too far off for him to remember. Sister. Agnes spotted the thingy around the kid's neck, and she gently picked it up to have a look-see. It was this tiny brass key, all old and not so shiny anymore, with these weird groovy lines on it that she'd never seen before. There were no fancy words or symbols on it like you'd expect if it was a big deal or something. She held on to it for a bit, then just let it drop back down to his chest. The kid, he didn't even budge or look down at it, like it was just another thing he didn't give two hoots about. You have nothing else on you? She asked, but Baker just shook his head like, no way, and the kid didn't say a peep. Sister Agnes got up and went. Over to the desk, tucked in the corner, she dragged this big ol' book over to her. The thing was massive, all covered in beat-up brown leather. Like it had seen better days. It had all these neat lines with names and stuff scribbled on the pages. She grabbed a pen and dipped it in some ink, then just stared at this empty spot, like she was waiting for a name to magically appear there. What shall we call ya? She whispered. To herself, her eyes glancing at the desk's corner. There was a little piece of paper with the day's bread info from the bakery, $3.71 for the delivery. She played with her pen, capped it on the page, and wrote real slow in dark ink. Jonah Price, foundling. The kid didn't give a name, so she picked one from the book's records. Closing the book, she glanced over at him. Jonah, she whispered, like she was trying out the word. He blinked but kept quiet. She gestured for Baker to come with her into the hallway, leaving the kid there in the room all quiet and stuff. In the corridor, she talked to him real soft, saying they'd take care of the boy, feed him, clothe him, and maybe, just maybe, his memories would come back eventually. Baker just nodded, his breath barely showing in the cold hallway air before heading back outside into the frosty night. Jonah remained in the chair, his legs dangling a bit since his feet couldn't quite reach the floor. His hands were kind of just chilling in his lap, not really doing anything. The flickery light from the fireplace in the other room was peeking through the open door and making the stone wall next to him look all cozy and warm. He was totally zoning out, not looking at anything in particular, just the empty spot on the wall. The brass key he had was like sitting heavy on him, but also like a memory that was pretty faint, like something he half remembered from a long time ago. A young lass strolled by the door on her way to get some water, and she took a quick peek inside, her eyes full of wonder at the new face she spotted. But Jonah? He was in a whole different world, not even noticing her. He was off in some place where the wind was wild and cold, making you feel like it could chew you up and spit you out, and the snow. Oh boy, it stung like nobody's business. It was like he was in a spot where every step you took echoed in the quiet night, and somewhere in that stillness, he could almost make out a voice calling out to him, but the name was all jumbled, like it was coming from a dream. Sister Agnes came back with a blanket that was folded up and a pair of shoes that had seen better days, but they looked like they could still do the job. She put the blanket around the kid's shoulders and put the shoes down next to him on the floor. You're gonna sleep in the dorm with the other kids, okay? She told him. You're safe here. But Jonah, he still didn't say a word. Instead, he just took the blanket and pulled it closer to him, holding on to it a bit tighter. As she led him to the dorm. The noise from the kids in the main room picked up again, like a bunch of wooden spoons playing in bowls and everyone whispering. Secrets. Jonah tiptoed kind of carefully, like he wasn't sure if his sneakers were allowed on that floor. The brass key she gave him dangled on a string around his neck, barely making a sound. But in his head it was like it was shouting, waiting for that moment when he'd finally get why he had it. Unlike the other children who filled the long halls of St. Brigid's Orphanage with chatter and restless movement, Jonah moved through the days with a quiet focus that made him seem apart from them. His hands, small and pale, were almost never still, always turning over bits of wire or scraps of wood or the broken toys the younger ones brought to him. He could fix things. No one else could. Locks that refused to open for the sisters would turn with a soft click under his touch. Clocks that had been silent for years would begin to tick again after he leaned over them in concentration, and the sewing machines in the laundry room with their rattling wheels and tangled threads would hum smoothly after his fingers had passed over their girths. Sisters often watched him work, sometimes in curiosity, sometimes in unease they had never taught him. These skills, no one had shown him the inside of a clock or the delicate teeth of a lock yet. He moved with the certainty of someone who had done these things 100 times before his brow would furrow slightly, his lips pressing together as he listened to the faint sounds of metal on metal, as if the broken thing in his hands was speaking to him and only he could understand. Its languibet, for all the things he could mend there, was one thing Jonah avoided completely: the mirrors of the orphanage. They were few and old, their silver backing spotted and darkened. With age, a small one hung in the washroom, another in the corridor near the sisters' quarters, and a tall, cracked one leaned against the wall in the storage room. Jonah would not pass too near them if he could help it. He would turn his head sharply when one came into sight, his shoulders drawing in as though bracing against something unseen. Once, when Sister Agnes asked him why he avoided the glass, he had replied in his soft, almost toneless way, "They make me feel watched, as if something is looking back at me that is not." Meth words had stayed with her, and though she had tried to laugh them off, a part of her found them troubling, for she had once stood before that same tall, cracked mirror in the storage room, and for a breath she, too, had felt the strange chill of being observed from the other side. Jonah's nights were no quieter than his days, though they were different in their unease. The dormitory slept in rows of narrow wooden beds. The children curled under thin blankets, their breathing filling the dark room with the slow rhythm of sleep. But Jonah would sometimes thrash beneath his blanket, his legs kicking free, his hands clenching at the air as if grasping for something just out of reach, and from his mouth would come words none of the others understood. They were not in the soft lilting tones of the prayers the sisters taught, nor in the rough clipped speech of the mining town. They were stranger than that, deep and broken, carrying a sound that made even the older boys fall silent. Somatized, the screams would wrench him upright, his gray eyes wide open, but seeing nothing in the dark. The sisters would come quickly, their footsteps sharp on the floorboards. Sister Agnes would sit beside his bed until the tremors in his hands stopped, until his breathing slowed, but he would never remember in the morning, or if he did, he would not say. The other children began to whisper about him, not out of cruelty at first, but out of the uneasy fascination children have for things they do not understand. They said he could hear the thoughts of machines, that he could speak to locks in a secret tongue, that he had dreams of a place far away where shadows moved like living things. Some were afraid of him and kept their distance. Others watched him closely, hoping to see him do something magical. Jonah seemed unaware, or perhaps simply indifferent to their talk. He worked when there was work to do. He ate when food was placed before him. He answered when spoken to, though rarely with more than a few words, and when he was alone his eyes would sometimes drift to the high windows of the orphanage, as if looking for something far beyond the sky on winter afternoon. Sister Agnes found him in the storage room, the tall, cracked mirror standing against the wall. He was not looking into it, but was crouched beside an old wooden chest, its lock rusted and stiff. His small hands worked over it with a quiet patience, the kind that made it seem he could wait forever for the right turn of the key or the right shift in the tumbler. She watched from the doorway, and in that moment she thought there was something in the way he moved, something that did not belong to a boy who had been found half frozen in an alley. When the lock clicked open, he sat back on his heels and glanced toward There was no surprise in his face at her presence, only a faint nod as though he had expected her to be there. The chest held nothing of value, only blankets and a stack of hymnals, but she found herself unsettled by the ease with which he had undone the lock that night as the wind rattled the shutters and the other children slept. Jonah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the brass key against his chest catching faint glints from the moonlight slipping through the window. Its presence was constant, a small weight reminding him of something he could not yet remember, and somewhere, deep inside the part of him that spoke to locks and clocks and machines, he knew that the key was not for anything in St. Brigid's and that someday it would open a door meant only for him. Rumors have a way of moving faster than the wind in a small town, and once Jonah's name began to pass from mouth to mouth, it seemed there was no corner of the streets where it did not travel in the dim warmth of the tavern with its fire snapping. In the hearth miners spoke of him in low voices between swallows of ale. They said he was the child of traveling thieves who had passed through years ago, leaving behind a trail of stolen goods, and one silent boy they claimed he had been taught to pick locks before he could write his name, that the brass key around his neck was a tool of his trade, not a keepsake in the cramped back room of the dressmaker's shop where women gathered to share tea and stitch hems. A different tale took shape. There they whispered that he was the last survivor of the riverboat fire, the one that had burned bright on the Susquehanna. 3 winters passed when the ice cracked under the heat and the smoke turned the night sky red. Some said they remembered a woman screamed carrying over the water. Others swore they had seen a child pulled from the wreckage, but that no one ever claimed him. The boy at St. Brigid's fit the story too well for it to be coincidence. And then there were the darker murmurs, the ones that spoke of bad luck, as though it clung to Jonah like frost on a window pane. They said the barn fire at the edge of town had started the week after Sister Agnes took him in. They pointed to the time the blacksmith's best horse went lame on the very day Jonah had stood watching it from the fence. They remembered how the winter seemed colder that year, how the crops in the spring came up thin, how small misfortunes seemed to gather like crows wherever the boy went. An unlucky child, they called him under their breath. Shopkeepers began to glance at him with narrowed eyes. When Sister Agnes brought him along to town, he would stand quietly beside her, hands folded in front of him, while she asked for flour or lamp oil yet. Some would shake their heads, claiming they were out of what she wanted, though she knew they had plenty in stock. Others would find small reasons to delay her until she grew tired of waiting and left without buying anything. It was not said aloud, but the message was clear. They did not want the boy under their roof. Jonah seemed not to notice, or perhaps he had grown used to it. He would walk beside Sister Agnes through the snow, his eyes fixed on the ground, his gray gaze catching only the tips of his boots as they moved. His hands would sometimes touch the brass key at his chest, not turning it, not fidgeting with it, only resting there as if to be certain it was still with him. And all the while, behind lace curtains and cracked shutters, the townsfolk would watch, their whispers curling into the cold air like smoke. The afternoon had settled heavy and silent over St. Brigid's Orphanage, the kind of winter day when the sky turned to a pale sheet and the snow outside fell in thick, slow flakes drifting in lazy spirals past the high windows. The workroom smelled faintly of old wood and iron shavings, the scent clinging to the air like a memory. Jonah sat at the narrow table where Sister Agnes kept broken things for him to mend. An old lock lay before him, its iron casing bent from years of use, and a pantry latch that no longer held its tongue when Turnitus. Hands worked without hurry, feeling the tiny movements inside the mechanism, his fingertips sensitive to the clicks and shifts, as if he could hear the language of the metal without sound. He always fixed things this way with a patience that seemed to belong to someone far older than a boy of his years. The bent edge came straight under his careful pressure. The latch began to slide smooth again, and yet his eyes were not on the lock for long. They kept dropping to the brass key that hung against his chest, key was old and dull from time the once bright surface. Now darkened with age he had never thought. Much of it beyond knowing it had been there as long as he could remember. The thin cord worn and fraying, but strong enough to keep it close to him, he had been told. Once or twice that perhaps it belonged to a door in a house far away or a chest. Someone had meant for him, but he had never tested it on anything. No, as the oil lamp flickered in the cold draft, he noticed details in the teeth he had. Somehow, never seen the grooves were not like the simple cuts of cupboard keys or the jagged shapes of door keys he had seen in town. These were fine, deliberate channels etched deep into the metal, curling in small turns that reminded him of the inside of a clock. There was a symmetry to them, a kind of design that spoke of something complicated. Maybe even Secreth's breath slowed as he turned it in the light, tilting it one way, then another, trying to read its pattern like a message, and then without warning a picture leapt into his mind, sharp and bright, as if it had been waiting all along. He was somewhere hot, the air thick with the smell of smoke, not the smoke of coal fires, but something harsher. The sound of voices shouting filled the space around him, muffled by the echo of stone walls. There was light, but it came in strange flickers. And in the middle of it all, he was running, feet pounding down narrow stone steps, the cold of the walls brushing his fingertips as he gripped the rail, a sense of urgency beating in his chest, like a second heartened just as quickly as it had come. It was gone, swallowed back into the dark, leaving only the faint hammer of his own heartbeat. The workroom seemed smaller now, the oil lamp light sharper, as if it had been watching him the whole time. His fingers tightened around the brass key as though it might somehow answer the questions. It had just woken, but the key lay still in his hand, its metal chilled against his skin. Set the repaired lock aside, but he did not pick up another piece of work. Instead, he sat in the narrow chair, listening to the slow fall of snow outside and the faint hum of the orphanage beyond the door, the laughter of the younger children in the hall, the muted steps of Sister Agnes as she passed on her way to the kitchen. But all these sounds felt far away. The weight of the key in his palm was too present, too heavy. Thought stirred in him, then unformed and quiet, that whatever this key opened it was not anything ordinary, and that wherever it belonged it was a place that would change everything. If he found it, the idea settled in him like the first ember in a pile of coal, small but ready to grow into something much greater when the time came. Slipped the key back under his shirt, feeling its cold edge against his skin as if to remind himself it was still real, and he promised in the silence of the workroom that he would not let it out of his sight. Whatever it meant, whatever it opened, he would be ready. When it found him again, the day the man came, the sky was low and heavy with the promise of snow, the air outside sharp enough to sting the skin. Sister Agnes had been in the front hall, speaking to the baker's wife, when the sound of boots on the wooden porch broke the quiet. A knock followed, slow and deliberate, and when she opened the door, there stood a tall, gaunt figure wrapped in a wool coat that hung past his knees, his face long and pale, the skin drawn tight over high cheekbones, his eyes a cold shade that seemed to see through whatever they looked upon. Spoke in a voice low, yet carrying an edge that made each word seem measured. He asked if there was a boy here. With gray eyes, he did not say the boy's name, but his tone carried the weight of certainty, as if he already knew the answer. Sister Agnes felt the prickle of unease in her spine. She clasped her hands together and told him no, there was no such child in her care. Her voice, steady though her heart had begun to beat hard. Earthman studied her for a moment, and then without another word, tipped his hat, turned and stepped back onto the porch, his boots crunching on the frost as he moved down the path toward the street. Yet even with his back to her, there was something about the way he carried himself that made the air in the hall feel colder. Upstairs, Jonah had been standing by the narrow window, his forehead almost touching the glass, the sound of the stranger's voice drifting faintly through the hall below. When his eyes fell upon the man, a jolt ran through him, sharp and sudden. His Breath caught in his throat so hard it felt as if the air had frozen inside him. He gripped the windowsill with both hands, the wood pressing hard into his palms, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might shake the glass had never seen. This man before of that, he was certain, and yet his whole body reacted as though he had stepped into the room of a memory. He could not call to mind, his hands trembled so badly he had to pull them to his chest, and for a long moment he could do nothing but watch the figure move away the dark coat against the pale drift of snow, each step somehow pulling something nameless from deep inside him. When the man vanished from view, the world did not feel the same. The hallway behind him felt longer, the walls closer, and the silence heavier. The key beneath his shirt seemed to press harder into his skin, and though he could not have said why, Jonah knew that the man would come back, and when he did, the questions he asked would not be so easily turned away. Weeks later, the wind carried the sharp scent of burning across the yard. It was evening, and the sky had just begun to fade into that deep blue that comes before night. The children were still inside finishing supper when the first shouts rose from the back of the orphanage. Jonah was near the window in the hallway, and he saw it before he heard the crackle of the barn behind. The orphanage was lit from within, a furious orange glow spilling through the gaps in the old wooden boards. Smoke coiled upward into the cold air, thick, and Rislesh ran with the others into the yard, where Sister Agnes and two of the older boys were already hauling buckets from the pump. The flames leapt high, clawing at the roof, the dry winter wood. Catching fast, the heat hit Jonah's face in waves, making his eyes sting, but it was not the fire that froze him. Where he stood, it was the movement inside the glow, a figure tall and thin, slipping between the beams of light and shadow. The shape bending slightly as it moved with a purpose that was too calm for the chaos around its outline, burned into his vision in the same way the strangers had that day on the porch, the same narrow shoulders, the same measured stride. And though the light twisted with the heat and the smoke rose in choking curls, Jonah knew with a certainty that gripped his chest like a vice that it was him. The man who had asked about the boy with gray ice roof gave a loud groan, and a shower of sparks fell into the snow around them, breaking his gaze. The others shouted and coughed and worked the buckets over and over, their breath making clouds in the night air. The horses from the nearby livery had begun to call out somewhere down the street. As the smoke drifted over town, the fire took nearly an hour to subdue, by which time the barn was little more than a blackened frame against the faint starlight. When the children were ushered back inside, Jonah lingered on the porch, staring at the charred remains of the barn, as if the figure might still be there, waiting just beyond the glow of the last embers. But the yard was empty, the snow falling again in quiet flakes, settling over the ruin like a blanket of ash. That night, Sister Agnes found him sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, his hands clasped tight around the brass key as if it could shield him. She knelt, so her eyes were level with his, and in a voice low enough that only he could hear, she told him that there were people in the world who would speak softly yet mean harm, who would ask about his past, not to help but to take something from him, something they had no right to, and she told him to trust no one who came with questions about who he had been or where he had come from. Her words sank into him like nails into wood, and though she did not speak the man's name, for she did not know it, the warning carried the same shadow that had stood in the fire. And from that night forward, Jonah understood that the mystery of his past was not only a puzzle to be solved, but a danger that would follow him until he learned the truth. The grandfather clock had stood in the corner of the orphanage hallway for as long as Jonah could remember, its tall frame of dark wood polished to a soft sheen, its pendulum swinging with a slow, patient rhythm that seemed older than the building itself. Lately, though, it had begun to lose time, the hands drifting minutes behind each day, until Sister Agnes asked Jonah to see what he could do to set it right, worked alone in the late afternoon light, when the others were in lessons, kneeling on the floor before the clock with the tools He had collected over the years a bent screwdriver, a file worn thin, a pair of pliers that creaked when he used them. He eased the front panel open. The smell of oil and dust rising from the gears inside, and began to study the workings. The brass teeth turning with their measured clickses, he leaned in, his fingers brushed against something that did not belong, a rough edge tucked deep behind the casing. He paused, shifted the gears aside, just enough to see, and there, wedged between the wooden frame and the metal plate, was a thin folded piece of parchment yellowed with age. He reached in, carefully working it loose until it came free. The parchment crackled as he unfolded it on the floor. The edges fraying, the ink faded but still legible. It was a map, not of the orphanage or the surrounding hills, but of Allegheny City. The lines of its streets drawn in a steady hand, the river winding along the edge. One street stood out, marked in a deep stroke of red ink, Water Street, the name written in tiny letters beside it. Jonah's eyes traced the route from the river to the red street over and over, his breath coming slow. He had never been to Allegheny City, but something in him recognized the shapes as if they had been stored somewhere in his mind, waiting to be uncovered in the margin of the map, faint enough that he had to tilt it toward the window light. There was a name, P. Whitlock, the letters small and sharp, as though written in hasty. Sat back on his heels, staring at it, the sound of the ticking clock behind him now louder than before each tick. Like a pulse in the room, he pulled the brass key from around his neck, letting it rest in his palm. The grooves catching the dim light, his gaze dropped to the corner of the map, and there, drawn in black ink beside Water Street, was a small symbol. A circle with a jagged line through its center. The shape was not decorative. It was precise, measured, and when he laid the key over it, the match was exact. Air in the hallway seemed to shift, as if the building itself had leaned in to listen. He felt the same tightness in his chest that he had felt when the stranger stood on the porch, and again, when he had seen him in the fire. It was the sensation of something unseen pressing close of a path, opening whether he was ready or no. Folded the map again, sliding it into the inside pocket of his coat, his mind turning with questions faster than he could catch them. Who was P. Whitlock? What lay on Water Street? Why was the key marked on the map? And how had it found its way into the orphanage? Clock, a place no one would think to look unless they were searching for more than a way to keep teammates. He stood. The clock gave a long, slow chime, the deep notes echoing through the hallway, and for a moment Jonah imagined they were not telling the hour, but answering him, the sound lingering in the air like a signal from far away. He closed the panel, wiped the dust from his hands, and looked once more toward the door at the end of the hall. Beyond it lay the cold streets of the town, the path to Allegheny City, and Water Street somewhere beyond that, and he felt the pull of it strong enough to make his fingers curl tighter around the brass key. Jonah woke some time recently, that to begin with light of day, break the sky still overwhelming and gray, the disgust cold and sharp in his lungs. He dressed rapidly in the shadows of the quarters, pulling his coat tight around him, the brass key warm against his chest, the outline covered up in the stash of his shirt, a guarantee of answers holding up for him. He looked once at the resting shapes of the other children and Sister Agnes, their breaths rising in moderate, indeed beat a update of the life he was taking off behind, if, as it were, for a small while, slipped unobtrusively down the lobby, his uncovered feet squeezing against the cold wooden floor, the entryway to the shelter. Yielding effortlessly to his touch, he pushed it open and ventured into the pre-dawn world, the snow underneath delicate and fine, suppressing his steps, the wind moo and still as if holding its breath. With him he moved rapidly through the limit boulevards, keeping near to the shadows, maintaining a strategic distance from the few lights that had been lit along the fundamental road. At the edge of town he found his, to begin with chance, a cart holding up by the blacksmith's yard. He crawled near the steeds, stamping in their saddles, the driver napping in the situate. Jonah held his breath and slipped on board, covered up behind sacks of coal and nourish. The cart moved gradually to begin with at that point, picked up pace, carrying him past commonplace lanes and into the edges where the buildings diminished and the waterway got to be obvious in the separate, its dull surface reflecting the blackout gray of the morning hen. The cart moderated, he hopped off and ran over the solidified ground toward the waterway where a coal freight ship had been moored overnight, its frame moo and dark in the water, the ropes tied freely to the dock, advertised him away on board. He climbed carefully, the wood dangerous and damp beneath his hands, the scent of coal sharp in his nose. The freight boat shaking delicately underneath his weight, as if it recognized him, the outline open in his hand, directing him noiselessly toward the city. Beyond hours passed, as the sun rose pale and frail in the sky, Jonah kept moving, running where he must. The boulevards of Allegheny City extended out around him, limit and swarmed indeed. This early, with the sound of carts and the intermittent yell of a laborer, he slipped through back streets and behind buildings, keeping to the edges of the waking world, taking after the map's cautious lines, until at long last he come to Water Road, the title composed in ruddy ink, striking in his Min distribution center, stood at the conclusion of the road, its dividers split, and weathered, the roof listing beneath a long time of disregard, the paint peeling in long twisting strips, the sheets distorted by time and rain, the entryway enormous and fashioned from pressed, the rust clinging to its surface like a moment's skin, the lockset profound and complicated instrument that looked impervious to anybody. But Jonah, he ventured closer, the key overwhelming and warm in his hand, as in spite of the fact that it had been holding up for this moment, considered the bolt, the grooves and teeth lining the pressed teeth of the component. Commonplace presently, as if he had dealt with them 100 times sometime recently, the key floated for a minute at that point, slipped in to put the metal, met the key superbly, the tap delicate but certain, a sound that appeared to resound through the calm road. He squeezed forward, the entryway yielding somewhat underneath his thrust, the sound of it scratching against the floor, uproarious in the purge morning inside the distribution center. The discuss was stale and cold, tidy coasting in contract shafts of light that sifted through the broken windows, the floorboards twisted and uneven underneath. Jonah's eyes balanced rapidly, taking in the space, the long shadows cast by cases and bars, the scent of ancient wood and clammy, the blackout follow of something metallic and covered up. He slipped the key back into his stash and moved cautiously more profound into the building, the feeling of expectation thick in his chest, the sense that each step was driving him closer to a truth that had been holding up for him for a long time. Jonah moved gradually into the stockroom, the blackout light from broken windows casting long shadows over the floorboards, the discuss thick with tidy and the scent of rust and ancient wood, he taken after the way laid out in the outline, his steps cautious and ponder as he drawn nearer. A dim chamber at the distant conclusion of the building, it was filled with press chests stacked aimlessly, records bound in broken calfskin, and cases that squeaked beneath the weight of anything they held. The dividers were lined with racks that vanished into the despair over his head. His hand rested on the brass key against his chest, the weight comforting, however resolute update that he had come for a reason. The floor moaned delicately underneath his feet as he moved closer to an expansive chest at the center of the room. He hunched to review the bolt, brushing the tidy from the surface, when all of a sudden a boisterous hammer reverberated through the chamber. The gigantic press entryway at the entrance closed with a constraint that shook the floor, the sound ringing in his ears and cutting off any way of escape. Jonah spun around, heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat, and there he saw him, the withered stranger, standing in the entryway, his long coat hanging overwhelming and dim as pale confront, nearly featureless in the dim light, the shadow of his tall cheekbones giving him a skeletal appearance, his eyes cold and sharp, unblinking and mindful of everything in the room. He ventured forward, the sound of his boots ponder and moderate on the wooden floorboards, the quiet of the stockroom broken as it were by the squeak of his movement. This voice came smooth and chilling, carrying over the purge chamber. You ought to not have come, Jonah. The words twisting in the disgust like smoke. His look flicked to the brass key in Jonah's hand for a minute, a shadow of acknowledgement passing over his confront, or possibly Jonah envisioned it, and at that point the words once more talked with a measured accentuation. Or ought to, I say, Nathaniel, the title landing overwhelming and interesting in Jonah's ears, a beat of stun running through him, as if the dividers themselves were holding their breath. Jonah's fingers fixed around the key, the metal cold, however lively, with a kind of certainty that he had never felt some time recently. He attempted to talk, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. His legs trembled underneath him, the floor uneven and insecure beneath the weight of what he abruptly caught on, that he had ventured into a put distant, bigger, and more seasoned than the halfway house, than the roads he had known. The distribution center, no longer fair a building, but a chamber of privileged insights, holding answers that had been kept from him his entire life. The stranger moved closer, each step measured as if he had practiced it 1,000 times, the shadows extending behind him, the pale light catching on his coat, making it seem nearly unearthly, the records and cases encompassing them, quiet witnesses to a past Jonah had, as it were, seen in dreams. The thin man's eyes flicked to the chest Jonah had been assessing at that point, back to the key, and at that point to Jonah's confront, his expression incoherent, however full of intention. A gulped, difficult, the title Nathaniel reverberating in his intellect, filling him with an interesting acknowledgement, a string of memory pulling at the edges of his awareness. The key against his chest felt hotter, more grounded, as if encouraging him to act, to claim what had continuously been his. The distribution center appeared to contract around him, the disgust thick and overwhelming, the shadows longer, the quiet louder, as he arranged himself for what he knew he seemed not avoid. The stranger raised one hand gradually, not debilitating, however, commanding the space. The words hung in the disgust, once more a caution and a guarantee. You ought to not have come, Jonah, or ought to, I say, Nathaniel, and for a minute time itself appeared to hold its breath. The pressed chest, the records, the cartons, all holding up for the another, moved the following disclosure. The key a help, and a flag in the dim chamber, that the minute for truth had at long last arrived. The title Nathaniel hit Jonah like a sudden blast of wind, thumping the breath out of him, recollections surging forward in a tide. He had never anticipated to feel his father's voice resounding through the passages of an amazing house calling. His title, the warmth and specialist in the tone he had, as it were, seen in parts through dreams and flashes, the sprawling domain he had never known. However, by one means or another, recalled the cleaned floors, the gem chandeliers catching the light, in a way that made the world shimmer. Saw a night of chaos, a veiled wrath tearing through commonplace passages, shadows moving quick against the dividers, the sound of yells breaking glass and fire, the feeling of being snatched and pulled from room to room, and the cold weight of something valuable squeezed into his little hands, a fear and a certainty, entwined, as if he had known indeed at that point that what he carried mattered more than his possessed security. The dreams, blurred as it were in part, taking off him, trembling and breathless, withered man, ventured closer, his nearness filling the dim chamber, the shadows falling in sharp lines over his pale confront, and presently Jonah knew the title Elias Vance, the voice smooth and exact, cutting through the fog of recollections. Your guardians were not the basic people who cleared out you in the back street, he said, words measured, however, overwhelming with history. They were investors, and they covered up something amid the war, something effective, profitable, unsafe. The brass key you carry opens one of the vaults your family secured. It contains records, reports prove of gold taken and covered up amid the accomplice. Jonah's fingers fixed on the key, the metal warm against his skin, nearly beating as if it recognized its possessed reason. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of disclosure squeezing on him. He had continuously felt isolated from the other children. The halfway house, the town, the instinctual. That had driven him to settle things to get at locks and components presently made sense as if they had been prepared into him by a past he seemed nearly keep in mind but not completely get a handle on until Elias Vance signaled toward the chests. Lined along the dividers, one in specific overwhelming press, obscured with age and rusted in places, the keyhole complicated and nearly evil in plan. The same image Jonah had seen on the outline presently reflected in the bolt itself, the records. Interior were stacked perfectly bound in calfskin with the weight of insider facts squeezing from their pages. He felt the drag of them like gravity, the guarantee of answers, the confirmation of who he was and what had been taken from his family. Bowed gradually, sometime recently, the chest, the key fitting superbly into the grooves and turning with a delicate press that reverberated through the stockroom, the sound profound and certain, nearly as if the chest itself recognized his nearness. The cover lifted with a swoon moan, the scent of ancient paper and tidy rising up to meet him, the records bound firmly, each page filled with cautious penmanship, numbers, accounts, exchanges, names, and dates, all indicating toward the covered-up accomplice. Gold that had been energetic absent from his family's domain amid the chaos of war. As he flipped through the pages, recollections and parts came more home: the domain, the yells, the concealed men, the freeze of his guardians, the unhinged covering. Up of the gold, the direness that had sent them to conceal everything that may secure their bequest, and presently here. It was in his hands, the confirmation unmistakable and evident, the brass key, not fair a device, but a bridge interfacing him to. A past that had been stolen from him, and an obligation that had been holding up for him to Elias Vance observed. Quietly, his expression garbled, but the nearness of information overwhelming between them, he talked. Once more a caution articulation. More than an address, the world will come for what you presently hold, Jonah, the gold, the records. The key, everything your guardians attempted to secure, everything they passed on attempting to keep secure. It will not be simple, it will not be basic. And presently you are the one who must see it through and get it. That the shadows of the past are never really gone, they, as it were, hold up for the right minute to rise. Jonah gestured. Gradually, his gray eyes relentless, the key warm and beyond. Any doubt in his hand, the records opened some time recently him, and to begin with time he caught on that he was not fair a boy, who had been found in an rear way. He was Nathaniel cost beneficiary to a bequest of riches, threat, and privileged. Insights and the stockroom around him no longer felt like a trap, but a edge put where the past met the display and where he would start to recover what was his. Elias Vance's voice was sharp and relentless, the shadows from the distribution center windows extending over his pale, withered confront like fingers. He inclined closer to Jonah, the records still open on the floor between them. His eyes cold and calculating, the weight of specialist squeezing down on the boy. You must tell me where the moment vault key is, he said, the words measured, however edged with risk. The request cutting through the dim light of the chamber, as in spite of the fact that the dividers themselves had retained his intention. Gazed back, his fingers still clutching the brass key, the image on it squeezing warm against his palm. He did not know of any moment vault. No one had ever talked of it, and however he felt the weight of Elias's look, attempting to pry privileged insights from him. His heart crashed in his chest, the sound uproarious in the calm stockroom, the memory of his guardians. The night of chaos, the veiled men, the covering up of the gold, all squeezing into his intellect, a update that he had as of now come as well distant. To donate in now, I do not know, he whispered at long last, his voice moved, but unfaltering. Elias Vance's eyes limited, his lips fixing the minute, extending long and tight the discuss, overwhelming with expectation, with the risk of savagery. The thin man's hand moved to the entryway, the bolt clicking behind Jonah with the irrevocability of a sentence. The vault room gulped him entirety, the dividers. Pressed cold and unwavering around him, the records presently futile as the entryway fixed with. A strong to Jonah's chest fixed, he ventured back and inspected the room, the dividers. Lined with metal boards, the floor uneven and dusty, a single contract window closed the ceiling. Letting in the gray light of the morning, he attempted the entryway. The keyhole insulting him, he may not elude from the front, but he did not freeze his intellect, as of now turning over each detail. Each instrument he had ever experienced, his hands following the edges of the locks, the press cold and overwhelming. Underneath his fingertips, the same intuitive that had continuously guided him presently honing into critical focus then. His eyes fell on the corner, a coal chute that ran down behind a stack of cartons, the opening fair, expansive, sufficient for him to press through the metal worn and unpleasant, the haziness interior profound, but not impervious. He stopped, tuning in the blackout. Reverberate of Elias's steps in the distribution center over a update that time was constrained, the brass. Key still warm in his hand, he took a profound breath, steeling himself against the cold and the fear, and slipped into the Chudithy. Section was contract squeezing against his shoulders, scratching along his coat, the disgust stale and noticing of coal tidy and rust, his heart dashing. Each sound increased the resound of his claimed developments. The obscurity total until the swoon flicker of gray exterior signaled the conclusion of the shoot. The cold gnawing at his uncovered skin, the metal, giving way to the open disgust, and at that point he dropped carefully into the waterway below. Water was solidifying a stun that took his breath absent. The current quick and dull carrying him downstream, he kicked and paddled impulses his legs. Numb, the cold wrapping around him like press chains, the waterway dragged him past wooden docks. Past shadows of distribution centers, the sound of the water uproarious in his ears, and the far-off reverberate of Elias's voice someplace behind him, a caution he might not decipher. Jonah surfaced, hacking the frosty water, stinging his lungs, the brass key squeezed to his chest, as it were thing keeping him fastened to the world. He kicked toward the bank, dragging himself out onto the solidified mud and snow water, trickling from his hair, from his coat, from each inch of him, the cold sharp sufficient to cut through to his bones, but he did not care. The stream had carried him absent from the vault room, absent from Elias Vance, for presently giving him space to breathe, to think, to plan lay. There for a minute, chest hurling, gazing up at the pale morning sky, the sound of the waterway hurrying past, blending with the removed calls of gulls and the blackout. Resound of the city waking around him, the brass key warm and strong in his hand to update that the privileged insights were not misplaced, that the records and the gold and the truth of his past were still inside reach, and that he had survived. That to begin with genuine test of the bequest that had been pushed upon him, Jonah pulled himself upright, shuddering, he squeezed the key into his stash and begun moving along the riverbank, each step cautious and think the cold desensitizing, but the assurance warming him from interior. He knew Elias would come after him, the thin man, quiet, tireless, clever, and however Jonah's claim abilities had carried him this distant, and they would carry him advance the waterway winding past distribution centers and docks and boulevards until he come to the cover of shadow and back streets where he might start to arrange his following move toward revealing the full truth of the vaults, the gold and his possess covered up past. Jonah lay on the cold riverbank panting for disgust, the frosty water still clinging to his hair and dress, his fingers numb and trembling, his chest hurling with each frantic breath, the morning haze floating moo over the surface of the stream, wrapping around him like a cover, the world quieted and gray, but for the thunder of the current and the blackout squeak of the wooden docks nearby, a shadow moved through the fog, and Jonah squinted against the pale light, a man's figure developing gradually. From the docks, a rope coil thrown over one bear and a long fleece coat overwhelming against the cold the stream. Labor bowed close to him, hands unpleasant and warm grasping Jonah's arms, pulling him up onto strong ground, the touch shocking. him back from the edge of fatigue into the sharp throb of Realistical Eb O'Rourke, his title, talked delicately and purposely, a voice gravelly, however kind, the man's eyes filtering the stream and the distribution center docks behind them as if anticipating inconvenience to take after the scent of coal and waterway mud clinging to him. Jonah shuddered, attempting to shake off the frigid water from his dress and hair, his teeth chattering, the brass key still tucked beneath his coat, squeezing reassuringly against his chest. Caleb's look relaxed as he looked at him, but there was a difficult edge underneath it, information of peril. A lifetime went through perusing the development of men and the shadows of the city. He talked moo-keeping, his voice relentless and calm. "You are fortunate to be lively," he said, and Jonah attempted to talk, but the cold stole his words and he gestured. Instep, gulping against the hurt in his throat, made a difference. Jonah to a little skiff covered up behind a stack of cases, clarifying as they moved down the stream in hush that Elias Vance was not fair any man. He was persistent, understanding, and perilous, somebody who had been chasing the banker's boy for a long time, somebody who would halt at nothing to secure the fortune covered up by Jonah's guardians amid the chaos of the gracious war, the gold, the records, the privileged insights, all portion of a bequest that had drawn Vance's covetousness and fixation for Decadus. Jonah tuned in his gray eyes wide the pieces of his past, clicking in to put the concealment, the domain, the covered-up vaults, the brass key, the dreams of fire and chaos, each memory presently given weight by Caleb's words Vance had been holding up for him, or maybe observing from the shadows. The whole time his instinctual that had guided him from the shelter, the locks, the keys, the instruments presently made sense as arrangement for what he confronted now. Caleb made a difference him into the warmth of a little cabin along the riverbank, the fire crackling in the hearth sending warm over their faces, the scent of smoke blending with the clamminess of the waterway. Jonah sat wrapped in covers, attempting to assemble the quality to talk, to inquire questions, to get at how distant this web come to. Caleb moved around the room unobtrusively, bringing a container of solid tea, the steam rising in strips over Jonah's vision. He talked once more of Vance's fixation and his strategies, the way he would track and take after without leniency, the lengths he would go to quiet anybody who knew as well much the fortune, the gold. The covered-up riches of Jonah's family had made him unsafe past degree, and however Caleb's words carried a guarantee that not all trust was misplaced, that there were those who might insure him if he was guided carefully, if he moved wisely. Jonah squeezed the brass key to his chest as he retained the disclosures, the weight of duty and threat settling intensely over him. However, to begin with time since the stockroom, the thought of moving forward brought a start of assurance, the records, the insider facts, the gold, all pieces of a perplex, as it were, he might unravel with Caleb's direction. The waterway winding around the cabin, the delicate sound of water lapping against the banks, reminding him that indeed in this solidified and tricky world, there were ways to take after, partners to believe, and plans to make. A Caleb's hand rested briefly on his bear, a firm establishing motion, a noiseless guarantee that he would not confront this alone, that somebody knew how to explore the perils ahead, somebody who caught on the lengths to which Elias Vance would go, and that they discover a way to keep him lively, to reach those who seem insure him, and maybe inevitably recover the bequest that had been stolen from him. Jonah gestured, discreetly letting the warmth of the fire leak into his solidified appendages and the sense of security and reason settle around him, the brass key underneath his coat, a update of the vaults and insider facts still holding up to be revealed, and the information that Elias Vance was out there observing, plotting, and holding up. But for presently, he had partners, he had trust, and a way to take after toward understanding his past and securing the future his guardians had attempted to secure. Caleb driven Jonah through a contract rear way, the mist twisting around the brick dividers like smoke, their boots quiet on the damp cobblestones, the morning light battling through the fog. the city around them waking gradually and however appearing neglectful to the threat that taken after in their shadows. He kept his hand on Jonah's bear, directing him carefully as they draw nearer a moo building tucked between stockrooms and deserted. Shops of put that appeared unremarkable but guaranteed security inside that entryway open to a warm shine. Jonah venturing over the edge and into a room filled with the scent of wood clean and ancient books, a fire burning in the hearth, the light glinting over racks of maps, records, and carefully stacked cartons. Caleb moved toward a little table in the corner and motioned for Jonah to sit. The boy complied, still shuddering from the waterway and the cold disgust exterior wrapping his arms around his knees, whereas he attempted to retain the weight of everything that had happened in the final few days. Caleb come to into a drawer and pulled out a photo. The edges worn, the picture dark and white and marginally blurred. He sat it tenderly on the table in front of Jonah and held up discreetly the firelight lighting up the confront of a lady whose gray eyes reflected his possess. It was inconceivable to see absent the sharp clarity of the look, the nature in the bend of the jaw, the tall cheekbones, the tender set of the lips. It was as in spite of the fact that he were looking into a reflect of the past and future. Combined, Jonah's fingers floated over the photo as he whispered her title in spite of the fact that he did not know it. However, the acknowledgement settled in his chest like a sudden warmth in the cold, the brass key still squeezed against his coat, reminding him of the vaults, the records, the gold, the perils that held up exterior these dividers. And however, here was a piece of his history that had been kept secure, a connect to the family he had thought misplaced. For Verkalib talked delicately, the words ponder and cautious. "You are not alone," he said, the voice unfaltering and warm. "She has been looking for you since the night your guardians were taken from you. She is your close relative, Margaret Cost." He observed Jonah's response, the eyes wide, the lips separated, the fingers trembling somewhat on the table. She knew something of what happened that night, something of the gold and the vaults, and she has kept herself covered up to secure herself and anybody who might be looking for Eugenia. Ingested the disclosure, the strings of his past bending together, the night of fire, the veiled men, the cries of his guardians, the flight from the shelter, the brass key, the records, and presently the picture of a lady who carried the same gray eyes, the same instinctual, and maybe the same metal he had continuously detected interior himself. A warmth spread through him, association that was more grounded than fear, more grounded than fatigue, more grounded than the waterway and the vaults and the dangers of Elias Vance. Caleb proceeded, clarifying Margaret's life since that night, how she had taken an accepted title, moved to Pittsburgh, the cautious steps she had taken to stay covered up from those who looked for the gold and who might hurt her family, the penances she had made to secure the bequest of the Cost family, and the fastidious look she had carried out for Jonah, the banker's boy, the beneficiary to a fortune and a mystery that had been covered up from him, until now. Jonah followed the photo with a fingertip, the gray eyes gazing back at him, nearly lively in the flashing firelight. A sense of reason settling in his chest, the brass key warm against his side, the records and the gold. Obligation that was no longer theoretical but tied to the family who had survived and ensured him in hush for a long time. The information that he was not alone, that somebody was holding up for him, that he had partners and a family willing to chance everything for him, brought a sharp center to his mind. Looked up at Caleb, the question starting to frame the direness squeezing in the room. The require to get at the full truth, to discover his close relative, to recover the privileged insights of the vaults and the gold, the peril of Elias Vance, still approaching past the safe house dividers, the waterway, and the city boulevards, covering up dangers in each shadow, and however here in this little room with the fire glinting, and the photo sometime recently him, Jonah felt a glint of trust, to begin with genuine start of a arranged shaping that he may follow. Caleb put a hand on his bear, immovably however delicately, and talked once more, reminding him of the stakes and the partners, He had presently of the family holding up and the planning that would be required to confront Vance and secure what had. A place to him, the gray eyes of Margaret Cost on the photo appeared to look specifically into Jonah's heart as he gestured. Gradually, the brass key squeezed against him a substantial update that the past was no longer misplaced and that he was prepared to step into the way that had been holding up for him since the night his guardians had been killed. The dim light of the boarding house sifted through contract windows, casting long shadows over the squeaking floorboards. Jonah ventured carefully behind Caleb's coat, soggy from the stream and the chill of the morning, the corridor noiseless but for the delicate stir of their boots on the worn wood and the swoon moan of the building, settling around them the scent of ancient wood. And mothballs waiting in the air. Caleb opened the entryway to a little room where a lady stood holding up the firelight glinting against her, uncovering sharp highlights relaxed by warmth in her gray eyes, the same gray that Jonah had seen in photos, the same gray that he recognized as his possessed. She grinned faintly, but her look was unfaltering, unflinching, as if she had been anticipating this minute for years. Jonah gulped difficult, the brass key overwhelming in his take, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the past, the stream, the distribution center, Elias Vance, and the vaults squeezing down. On him, however, here was an earnest calm, and commanding a connect to the family he had thought misplaced. The lady ventured forward, her hands amplified briefly and welcoming, her voice delicate. However, beyond any doubt welcome, Nathaniel, she said, utilizing the title that had been covered up from him all these a long time, and Jonah felt an unusual shudder at the sound. Avish affirmed what he had, as it were, started to piece together: the night of fire, the chaos of veiled men, the vanishing from his domestic, a long time in the shelter, all driving to this minute. You are Nathaniel Cost, she said, beneficiary to both the fortune and the privileged insights that have been watched by your family for eras. Your guardians took measures to secure you and their bequest, and presently it falls to you to get it and claim what was cleared out for you. Jonah's chest fixed, the disclosure settling over him like a physical weight, the title, the character, the truth of who he had been all along, entwining with the brass key and the records and the stream and the distribution center. He tuned in eagerness as Margaret talked of the family domain, the covered-up vaults, and the cautious arranging. His guardians had attempted to secure the gold and the reports amid the turbulent, a long time of the gracious war, the bequest and threat interwoven with the exactness that had kept it secure for decades. Then she uncovered the another piece of the perplex. The portion that had been lost, the key to the moment vault, covered up all this time in plain locate. The coat she had kept since his father's passing collapsed carefully on the edge of a chair, the lining worn delicate and dull, the brass key he as of now carried would open thee to begin with, and this coat held the moment a mystery degree, taken by his guardians to guarantee that, as it were, he might get to what had been covered up. The thought of it made his fingers fix impulses around the key in his pockets, clarified how the coat had been protected through a long time of mystery, how she had moved from put to put, keeping it secure beneath accepted names, how it had survived the chaos and threat that had claimed so much of the family, and how it presently rested here in the boarding house as a last test and a bridge to his legacy, the moment key fundamental, not as it were to opening the vault, but to understanding the full scope of what his guardians had battled to protect. Jonah followed the folds of the coat, his gray eyes reflecting the flashing firelight, his intellect hustling with conceivable outcomes, threats, and plans. The brass key in his hand abruptly felt lighter, however, by one means or another, more imperative, a charm and obligation all at once. Margaret observed him closely, her look understanding and knowing, as if measuring the preparation in his pose, the assurance in his hands and the fire in his eyes. The minute charged with anticipation. She talked once more, reminding him that the way ahead would be unsafe, that Elias Vance would not yield, that the riches and the insider facts he looked for would draw those who craved them like shadows to a fire, but that he had the expertise, the instinctual, and presently the direction to explore it. He was no longer the vagrant in the rear way, but Nathaniel cost beneficiary to a bequest of threat and opportunity. A boy who had survived fire, waterway, and disloyalty, presently standing on the limit of recovering what was his Jonah gestured, gradually retaining the weight of her words and the unmistakable nearness of the coat, the lining stowing away the moment. Key the way forward clear, however full with danger the brass key. Squeezed against his chest a update of the vault he had as of now opened and the travel. However, to come the shadows of Elias Vance holding up exterior and the bequest of the cost. Family extending behind him and sometime recently him like a street lined with both threat and guarantee asterisk. The wind cut through the contract boulevards of Pittsburgh like a edge, the disgust frosty and sharp against Jonah's cheeks as he and Margaret ran behind Caleb, their boots clattering against the solidified cobblestones. The haze rolling moo over the city, the shadows extending long and misshaped in the powerless light of lights, swinging from road corners, each reverberate a update that Elias Vance was near behind, and that each step seemed be the contrast between capture and survival. Jonah's heart beat in his chest, the brass key and the coat with the moment, key overwhelming against his side the recollections of the stockroom. The waterway and the insider facts squeezing in his intellect, the direness of the minute honing his instinctual. He may feel the nearness of Elias following them like a predator persistent and relentless, and however for each step Elias took, Jonah and Caleb balanced their course, ducking into back roads, slipping behind carts and wagons, utilizing the shadows and the ice-smooth roads to their advantage. Sounds of interest reverberated off the brick buildings, the yell of Elias's voice. Chilling and exact, calling out their names, his figure seen briefly at corners pale. Thin coat trailing behind him like a specter, the pressure mounting with each turn and turn of the city boulevards. Jonah felt the weight of obligation on his shoulders. Not fair for the keys, but for Margaret, for the bequest, for the fortune, and the privileged insights. That had been covered up for decades, risen at long last at the ancient waterway docks, the solidified timbers, extending into the dim water, the scent of coal and brine thick in the discuss, the stream moving quick and dull underneath them, the mist twisting over the surface, like smoke the zone left, but for the removed squeak of a solitary crane swinging in the wind and the periodic reverberate of water lapping against the docks. Jonah knew they had no place cleared out to run the last encounter. Was Aurelius showed up from the fog, his steps think and certain, the thin highlights. Sharp in the dim light, the eyes cold and calculating, he held Margaret solidly at his side, her coat tangled in his grasp, the lining of the moment, key presently fair, out of reach the risk. Unmistakable, the request straightforward and dangerous. Deliver me the keys, he said, his voice smooth and ice sharp. The pressure thick sufficient to choke the discuss around them. Asterisk. Jonah solidified for a pulse analyzing. The scene, the waterway behind Elias, the cases and ropes around the docks, the lean ice splitting beneath their feet, each detail a potential advantage. Each shadow a conceivable elude. He weighed the brass key in his hand, the coat in Margaret's get a handle on, and the frantic required to secure her, to outmaneuver a man who had chased him for a long time. The minute extended long and rigid, the haze wrapping around them like a shade of uncertainty. Thinking quick, he snatched one of the keys from his stash and heaved it, with all his quality, into the dull waterway underneath, the sprinkle resounding over the docks. Elias's look snapped toward the water, his hold releasing somewhat the transitory diversion long sufficient for Caleb to move with dangerous exactness, the push of the hand striking the back of Elias with constraint sufficient to stun him, the thin man wavering beneath the unforeseen assault, his adjust tossed off by the combination of astonish and the frigid ground underneath. The Margaret turned free from Elias's get a handle on her coat, clutched firmly to her chest, the lining presently available. The moment key inside reached Jonah lurched toward her, recovering it quickly. The brass key and the recently recuperated key both squeezed to his chest, a unmistakable guarantee of security, and used the waterway whirling adjacent, reflecting the pale light. The frosty shower from the current carrying with it the adrenaline and help of the momentalias recouped, rapidly growling his disappointment and seethe, self-evident in the set of his jaw and the streak of his eyes, but Caleb and Jonah presently had the advantage, the withered figure amazing in reverse as they moved to a more secure position, the mist and the dim water advertising cover as Jonah's intellect hustled, plotting the following steps, the keys in hand, the bequest of the cost, family holding up for him to recover, and the information that to begin with time, he had survived the coordinate showdown with the man who had frequented his life-eth. Chill of the waterway, the scent of coal, the mist twisting around the docks, the beating of his heart, each detail carved into his memory a update of threat, but moreover of strength, of speedy considering and believe of the bond between them, and the realization that the way forward was still unsafe, but presently inside reach with the keys in hand. And Elias briefly staggered Jonah and Margaret seem at long last start to arrange the recovery of their family's fortune and privileged insights in the shadow of the city and along the frosty riverbanks. The distribution center lingered quiet against the gray morning sky. Jonah stood adjacent to Margaret and Caleb, observing as government specialists moved quickly through the overwhelming entryways. The brass keys in his stash felt heavier, presently not with danger, but with the weight of equity at long last closing in after a long time of mystery and peril. The ice on the ground crunching delicately underneath their feet, the disgust thick with the fragrance of tidy press, and the swoon build-up of coal smoke from the stream. Nearby agents in dull coats and caps moved with systematic accuracy, opening cartons and pressed chests, their gloved hands lifting records and sacks of gold, tidying the surfaces of the overlooked treasures. The reports carefully protected, the coins and bars sparkling slowly in the quieted light prove of a fortune long covered up, however fastidiously accounted for. Jonah observed each development, the story of his family unfurling sometime recently him each step, bringing clarity to decades of riddle and fear. Elias Vance stood controlled at the edge of the stockroom, his pale, withered confront bent with dissatisfaction and skepticism, the government officers holding him solidly, a calm specialist transmitting from them that differentiated strongly with the outrage and franticness carved over his highlights. He had chased the bequest for a long time, had chased the banker's boy, had undermined and cornered. And however presently he found himself frail, the perfection of an interest that had crossed decades at long last halted in the hands of Jonah, felt a surge of alleviation tempered by the fatigue of the long battle, the stockroom no longer a put of fear but of determination, the chests and records presently being catalogued, each piece of gold and each record a declaration to the determination of truth, and the cautious arranging of his guardians, the brass keys that had guided him here squeezed delicately against his coat, an image of both legacy and survival, a bridge between the past and the future. Caleb moved to Jonah's side, whispering words of consolation and pride. The waterway docks the chase through frigid roads and the showdown, with Vance all driving to this minute when equity was served and the fortune recovered. The mumbles of specialists cataloging the treasures of foundation refrained to the calm affirmation of a bequest, re-established a family title vindicated, and the weight of history at long last acknowledged. Margaret ventured forward, her gray eyes relentless as she observed the operators move through the distribution center, her hands brushing gently against Jonah's bear, a quiet guarantee and shared alleviation. The penances she had made a long time in covering up the cautious guarding of the moment. Key the persistence and strength it had taken, all coming full circle in this calm triumph, a family rejoined in soul and title, and a fortune returned to those with legitimate claim. The cost bequests cleared of shadows and threat records were inspected and confirmed the gold numbered and recorded each piece in certification of the truth that had been clouded for so long. Jonah taken after the specialist from chest to chest, retaining the fastidious care with which they worked the names of claimants, whispered and famous the information that equity was being sanctioned. Substantial and genuine a handle that changed fear and instability into clarity and compensation. A stockroom arranged where history and determination met in. A calm solemnitygena looked at Elias one final time, the thin man limited, however, fuming the weight of his fixation presently. Insignificant the interest of eagerness and mystery, fixed by assurance, strength, and the cautious arranging of those who had come some time recently him a update that no matter how persistent the risk, no one is untouchable. When equity moves consistently and purposely forward, the bequest protected and reclaimed. Cold morning discuss of Pittsburgh brushed against. Jonahs confront the waterway obvious through the open distribution center. Entryways streaming consistently as if to carry absent the final follows of threat and fear, the fog twisting in strips over the docks, the city around them arousing, however, careless to the dramatization that had fair unfurled in its shadow, a calm peace settling over the Cost family, to begin with time in decades. A sense of closure and re-established reason settling like a warm mantle over shoulders long burdened. By uncertain Tygenus squeezed the brass keys to his chest, at last understanding the travel. They had taken him on the waterways, the rear ways, the docks. The chase, the encounter, and the extreme recuperation of the fortune, each step a lesson in flexibility, strength, and believe the Cost family, title cleared, their history secured, and the treasures re-established to their legitimate, put a chapter closed. However, unused one starting in the light of truth, survival, and recovered bequest. The daylight fell delicately through the tall windows of Margaret's house, casting warm, brilliant designs over the wooden floors. Jonah. Presently, Nathaniel moved carefully along the corridor, the brass keys he had carried for so long tucked securely into a drawer, the house calm but for the blackout squeak of floorboards and the far-off murmur of the city exterior. The disgust noticed faintly of cleaned wood and the waiting fragrance of ancient paper, a consolation he had never known before. Margaret guided him through the rooms, her gray eyes calm and persistent as she appeared him, where the furniture had been orchestrated, how the house had been arranged to welcome him, the rooms filled with light and warmth, a stark differentiate to the cold. Rear ways the waterway and the dull shadows of the stockroom, the sense of security and having a place squeezing delicately against the dividers, as if the house itself recognized the return of a family beneficiary and grasped him in silence. Nathaniel sat at an expansive oak table with a stack of his father's ancient records, spread some time recently him, the pages yellowed and delicate, however, filled with cautious penmanship, fastidious accounts, and cautious records of a life committed to family commerce and covered-up legacies. He ran his fingers along the ink, following names and numbers, recognizing designs that indicated at both the riches and the obligation he had acquired, the complexity of the accounts, a reflect of the challenges his guardians had confronted amid the turbulent a long time of war, and Secretary Margaret sat adjacent watching him unobtrusively, the swoon grin on her lips, reflecting pride and a sense of alleviation, the long time of looking and guarding driving, to this minute when the boy she had trusted to discover was at long last, here learning the ways of his family, following the history, and remaking the story piece by piece. The separate of misplaced a long time, gradually bridging with each page. He examined each record, he inspected each story his father had recorded, a life recovered through cautious consideration and unfaltering hand, found not as it were numbers, but stories, insights of bravery, chance, and tricky woven into the family. Records, the covered-up measures taken to ensure riches and insider facts. The cautious concealment of gold amid the gracious war, the methodologies and choices that had formed the Cost family's bequest and protected it against those who would Abuse it, the realization establishing him in the information that he was not fair a survivor, but an overseer of history, and believe a part he had been arranged for without ever knowing. Warmth of the house settled around him, the nearness of Margaret, unfaltering and defensive, the calm beat of day-by-day life, a analgesic against the injury and misfortune of the past. The brass keys presently resting securely in his drawer, a substantial update of the travel he had survived the stream. The back roads, the distribution center, the encounter with Elias Vance, and the recuperation of the family fortune, all merging into a sense of achievement tempered by reflection and memory. Learned gradually the subtle elements of the bequest. The accounts and the histories inserted in each section, the lessons of judiciousness, mettle, and premonition passed down in the ink of the records. The stories of his parents' penances, the measures taken to secure the future, the complex move of bequest and survival, unfurling sometime recently him embroidered artwork of family life, reproduced through think about persistence and developing understanding national, started to feel the calm delights of domestic, the basic warmth of dinners. Shared the delicate discussion by the fire, the consolation of a put, where he had a place, a sense of personality at last, shaping around the information of who he was and where he came from the misplaced. A long time checked him with scars, however. They no longer characterized him, the information of family history, the security of a secured bequest, and the direction of Margaret, giving him an establishment to develop into his genuine self, gray eyes of father and close relative and himself, reflecting in minutes of thought the sense of progression, the consolation that history, in spite of the fact that broken, might be revamped through care, consideration, and adore. The brass keys a image not as it were of entryways open, but of ways, secured of lessons learned and obligations, accepted the past display and future, merging into a life at last tied down in warmth, security, and understanding. The evening fell, and the firelight flashed over the room. Nathaniel followed the last passages in his father's records, a sense of peace settling over him, the echoes of the stream, the stockroom and the chase blurring into memory, supplanted by the delicate cadence of domestic and family, the story of the cost bequest clear and intaglio, a bridge from misplaced childhood to recovered personality and a future prepared to be formed by boldness, intelligence, and the consistent direction of those who had held up to welcome him. Domestic asterisk, the daylight spilled through the tall windows of Nathaniel's ponder, casting warm designs over the cleaned wood of the work area, where he sat, the brass key resting in a little wooden outline, its surface catching the light and reflecting a delicate, brilliant shine that appeared to fill the room with calm quality and history, the key once an image of fear and instability, presently held in stillness as a confirmation to the travel he had persevered and the trials he had survived. Nathaniel's fingers waited on the edge of the outline, following the cool metal through the glass. The recollections of back streets, the waterway, the stockroom, the frigid docks, and Elias Vance squeezing against his intellect, a montage of fear, boldness, and assurance that had molded the boy he once was into the man he had ended up. Each challenge confronted, each choice made, each life spared in danger, overcome, presently crystallized in the straightforward, exquisite nearness of the key, a image that talked louder than words of strength and triumph. Think about was calm, but for the swoon ticking of a grandad clock, the scent of ancient books and cleaned wood blending with the blackout smell of candle wax from the evening. Sometime recently, Nathaniel inclined back in his chair, his gray eyes reflecting the delicate shine of the key, the room around him filled with records and diaries, the chronicles of his father and the fastidious records of a family bequest carefully reproduced and presently safely in his hands. The brass key serving as an update that fear seemed be changed into quality and secret, into knowledge thought of Margaret adjacent in the other room, going to family. Things, her nearness unfaltering and comforting update of the family. He had recovered the direction and cherish that had carried him through a long time of instability, the key in its outline, bridging past and show connecting the bequest of the Cost family with the future. He was presently free to shape the life he had battled, to claim the weight of the key in his intellect. Overwhelming with importance, however light with Nathaniel reflected on the waterway that had merely claimed him, the frigid water that had tried his resolve, the back roads and boulevards of Pittsburgh that had chased him to the docks. The encounter with Elias Vance and the recuperation of the fortune, all minutes presently refined into the calm centrality of the brass keyed situation on the work area, a quiet certification of boldness, procedure, and immovable assurance. A marker of the way he had strolled and the choices he had made to reach this point. Key no longer had a place exclusively to the past. It had ended up portion of the living account of his life, a update that indeed in the darkest shadows of fear and instability, strength might sparkle through, that information might win over duplicity, and that the truth he had revealed through persistence and bravery had enduring control. He looked at it and felt a calm pride in the boy he had been and the man he had ended up to travel, carved into his memory as clearly as the grooves on the brass surface itself. As the evening sun moved over the room, the brilliant light flickering off the outline, Nathaniel envisioned the numerous eras of his family, who had depended on metal and cautious arranging to protect their bequest, the brass key presently an image of coherence, of tirelessness, and of the lessons learned through misfortune and battle. It rested, noiselessly, however effectively, a bridge between the trials of the past and the guarantee of the future. Unmistakable update of the strength that characterized him. Stood and moved to the window, looking at the city past the calm boulevards and the stream, winding through the heart of Pittsburgh. The haze of past threats long lifted the sense of peace and reason settling profound inside him. He returned to the work area, running a hand gently over the outline, the brass key catching the light once more and securing him in the information that he had confronted fear and vulnerability and developed, not as it were intaglio but reinforced. The story of Nathaniel cost a living confirmation to boldness, perseverance, and the control of truth at long last. Secured Nathaniel ventured back from the work area, the key in its outline at the center of his think about a calm landmark, to the travel he had survived, to the truths he had revealed, and to the strength he had carried from the rear ways and waterways to the warmth of domestic. The brass key no longer an antique of fear or puzzle, but an enduring image of triumph, intelligence. And the family bequest he had recovered to update that indeed the darkest ways may lead to light, and that strength and diligence would persevere. Past each trial asterisk by the delicate light of spring, Nathaniel Cost strolled gradually through the town square, the chill of winter at long last blurring the cobblestones dry and warm underneath the recognizable lanes, presently showing up less threatening and more inviting. Each storefront and rear way, once shadowed by whispers and doubt, presently appeared to recognize him as something more than the boy who had showed up in the snow months sometime recently. The brass key, securely tucked in his coat, an image of the travel that had changed him, felt the sun on his confront, the tender breeze, carrying the fragrance of sprouting blooms from the town gardens and the blackout smell of new bread from pastry kitchens that had once denied section. When he had been with Sister Agnes, the townspeople strolling past delayed briefly, advertising, respectful gestures and delicate welcome, their eyes presently filled with regard or maybe than interest, or fear, the notoriety of the quiet boy with no past, supplanted by the nearness of Nathaniel Cost, beneficiary to a bequest recovered and a family's title cleared. As he moved through the square, he reflected on the travel that had brought him here. The rear ways where he had been found, the halfway house where Sister Agnes had given him care in spite of his hush, the distribution center. On Water Road, the frigid waterway, docks, the encounter with Elias Vance and the recuperation of the family fortune, each memory squeezed delicately against his intellect, the weight of the past adjusted presently by the warmth and clarity of the Display a life recreated piece by strength, insights, and perseverance. Second, playing close the wellspring delayed to see up at him a indicate of acknowledgement. Maybe in the gray eyes he shared with Margaret, the grown-ups whispered delicately. To one another looks that carried endorsement and adoration, a town that had once dreaded hardship in. His nearness presently recognized his flexibility and the truth. He had revealed the brass key that had guided him through shadows and peril presently. Rested in his think about a domestic update that fear had been changed into understanding and triumphantly ceased. Briefly closed the central statue of the town author, following his fingers gently along the cool stone, the forms commonplace. However pervaded with an unused noteworthiness, the town itself felt diverse. The same lanes and buildings, however seen through the focal point of character and reason and association to history and family, establishing him immovably in the information of who he was and where he had a place, the vagrant of winter, presently the youthful man of spring, a image of survival strength, and reclamation thought of Margaret close to him, directing and supporting him, of Caleb and the stream that had nearly claimed him and however had too appeared him the way the brass keys. The records, the covered-up vaults, the lessons learned through fire and fear, all meeting into a clear way forward. A life no longer directed by shadows but characterized by choices, quality, and the cautious stewardship of the bequest he had been endowed to protect the town square, a calm organized for the return of a boy who had been misplaced and presently found as he proceeded strolling. The townspeople started to recognize him more transparently, gestures of affirmation turning into brief grins. A few advertising words of welcome and appreciation for metal shown, for truths uncovered, and equity at last ordered the whispered rumors, supplanted by stories of bravery and inside stories of the distribution center, the waterway docks, and the showdown with Elias Vance, as of now circulating discreetly among the inhabitants, a quiet celebration of the conclusion of fear and the return of Nathaniel come to the edge of the square, delaying to see toward the slopes, past the town, the waterway, flickering faintly in the separate, the warmth of the spring sun on his shoulders. A sense of flexibility and plausibility extending some time recently him a future. No longer dubious, a life grounded in character and family, a bequest protected and secured, the vagrant with no past presently completely show in the world around him, prepared to construct upon what had been recovered and to honor those who had guided him to this moment, strolled on at long last, letting the calm quality of the day settle into his bones. The town square lively, however tranquil, the echoes of his travel blurring into memory, but the lessons of strength, boldness, and family persevering inside him, the brass key at domestic surrounded and typical, the records fastidiously examined, the fortune secured, and returned the family title, cleared the past accommodated, and the future open and promising the vagrant had gotten. To be a man, the boy with no past had found, not as it were his history, but moreover the life he was implied to let Nathaniel cost move forward with unfaltering steps, the gray eyes clear and certain, the weight of his travel behind him, and the guarantee of spring ahead, a town that once whispered presently gestured in regard. The bequest of his family secure, the lessons of fear and survival changed into shrewdness and mettle, the vagrant had genuinely found both his past and his future. And as the sun rose higher over the town square, he knew that he had a place not fair in the lanes and back streets, but in the life he had battled to recover, in the warmth of domestic, in the belief of family, and in the acknowledgement of a community that had at last seen the truth.